For centuries, the story of Rome has been told as a tale of emperors and generals, of legions marching across continents, and of men who bent the world to their will. But hidden between the lines of this grand narrative are figures who shaped the empire in ways that are just as profound, yet far less acknowledged. These figures were not commanders on the battlefield or senators in the forum. They were women who operated within the very heart of imperial power, navigating a society that denied them official authority yet could not function without their influence. They were mothers, wives, advisors, and strategists. They were both celebrated and vilified, remembered as virtuous matrons or dangerous schemers. But what unites them is that they mattered. Their choices, alliances, and ambitions rippled across the empire, influencing succession, shaping culture, and at times, deciding the fate of Rome itself. What makes their stories so intriguing is not only what they achieved, but how they achieved it. In a world where open political power was reserved for men, these women carved out their authority in ways that defied expectation. Some cloaked their influence in modesty, others seized it boldly, and still others cultivated it through intellect and culture. Their legacies challenged the long-held assumption that Roman history was a man's story alone. They invite us to look closer, to question the narrative we've inherited, and to uncover the hidden architects who built and sustained an empire from the shadows. Welcome to our channel, Words of Time, and in this video we will journey into the lives of Rome's most powerful empresses, women who defied their world's limits and left an indelible mark on history. Roman history is often told as a story of conquest, politics, military strategy, and the deeds of powerful men who shaped the fate of one of the greatest empires the world has ever known. Generals, senators, emperors, and statesmen dominate the pages of classical texts, while the voices of women are faint, almost echoes hidden in the margins. For centuries, the assumption has been that women existed only in the shadows of their husbands or fathers, confined to private spheres and stripped of any real influence over the political and social machinery of Rome. Yet a closer look at the fragments, anecdotes, and records that survive suggests that this is a deeply incomplete picture. The empire was not only shaped by the strategies of emperors and the discipline of legions, but also by the quiet, persistent, and sometimes direct interventions of women who lived within its most elite circles. These women, often empresses or imperial consorts, navigated the constraints of a patriarchal society to carve out forms of authority that challenged the male-centric narrative. The Roman world was heavily patriarchal, and Roman law, tradition, and cultural expectations placed women under the guardianship of men for most of their lives. A daughter was expected to obey her father, a wife her husband, and a widow her son or another male relative. Public life was seen as the domain of men, particularly politics and military matters, while women were expected to focus on the household, weaving, and child-rearing. This structure has often led both ancient writers and modern readers to assume that women were largely passive participants in Roman history, secondary characters in a story driven by men. Ancient historians such as Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio often framed empresses as either corrupting influences or tragic figures rather than political agents in their own right. This biased lens further strengthened the misconception that women were only ever wives, consorts, or ornaments in the imperial palace, with little or no agency of their own. The reality, however, was far more complex. Even in a society designed to limit female authority, the very structure of the imperial household created opportunities for women to wield power, both behind the scenes and at times openly. The emperor's household was not merely a private space, it was the heart of Roman politics. Whoever had the emperor's ear could influence appointments, policies, and even military campaigns. Empresses and imperial women, by virtue of their proximity to the emperor, occupied a unique and ambiguous position. They had no formal titles or recognized legal authority equivalent to that of senators or magistrates, but their access and influence often surpassed that of many official office holders. This paradox made them both vital and threatening in the eyes of Roman commentators, who frequently painted them in extremes, either as virtuous mothers of the state or as scheming, manipulative figures who destabilized the empire. The common misconception that empresses were merely decorative or submissive consorts falls apart under scrutiny. In many cases, these women played critical roles in succession politics, in shaping the public image of the dynasty, and in acting as intermediaries between the emperor and the wider population. Some were active patrons of art, architecture, and public works, leaving physical legacies that outlasted their lifetimes. Others were involved in decisions about imperial heirs, often ensuring the continuity of dynasties during moments of crisis. Still others provided models of morality, piety, and family life that were projected onto Roman society as ideals to be imitated. Empresses could not lead armies into battle or address the Senate in their own right, but their influence seeped into the very core of Roman power, often determining the outcomes of struggles that shaped the empire. The image of empresses as powerless companions is further complicated by the ways they were portrayed by contemporaries. Writers often downplayed their achievements or attributed their influence to dangerous ambition. Yet the very existence of such accusations points to the fact that women were active participants in political life. An empress who could be accused of plotting, interfering, or manipulating was clearly not silent or irrelevant. Instead, she was recognized, even if begrudgingly, as a force whose presence mattered. The criticism directed at these women reveals the unease of a society that struggled to reconcile its patriarchal ideals with the undeniable impact of female agency. Some of the most famous names in Roman imperial history illustrate just how significant the role of empresses could be. Figures such as Livia Drusilla, the wife of Augustus, set the tone for what it meant to be an empress. She was not only a loyal partner but also a political ally, advisor, and a matriarch who ensured the stability of the new imperial system. Her reputation was both celebrated and criticized, but her imprint on the early empire is impossible to ignore. Later women, such as Agrippina the Younger, mother of Nero, wielded influence so openly that she was accused of trying to govern Rome through her son. Even empresses like Julia Domna, the wife of Septimius Severus, held intellectual salons, engaged with philosophers, and became key figures in projecting imperial legitimacy during a turbulent era. Each of these women operated within the strict confines of a patriarchal world, yet each left a mark that challenges the assumption of female passivity. It is important to note that not every empress wielded power in the same way, nor did all have the same opportunities. Some were content, or perhaps forced, to remain in the background, while others seized chances to play more active roles. What unites them, however, is the fact that their influence existed, whether acknowledged or denied. They were not merely wives or consorts, waiting silently while emperors made history. They were participants, strategists, patrons, and in some cases, rulers in all but name. By examining their lives and legacies, we can begin to uncover the hidden architects of Rome, the women who operated in the shadows of power, but who helped sustain, shape, and even redirect the empire at critical junctures. This re-examination forces us to challenge the male-centric narrative that has long dominated the story of Rome. To focus only on emperors and generals is to miss half of the picture. The empire was a complex organism, and within it, women played indispensable roles that deserve recognition. Their power was often subtle, sometimes indirect, but no less real. In fact, the very subtlety of their influence is part of what makes their stories so compelling. To navigate a society that explicitly denied them formal authority and still emerge as figures of consequence required immense skill, resilience, and intelligence. These qualities allowed them to survive and thrive in an environment where a misstep could lead to exile or even death. The story of Roman empresses is not simply about highlighting a forgotten group of individuals. It is about questioning the frameworks through which history has been written and asking who gets to be remembered as a maker of history. By peeling back the layers of bias and assumption, we uncover a richer, more nuanced picture of the Roman world. It is a picture where women are not erased, but are restored to their rightful place as participants in the drama of empire. The stage was never exclusively male, even if official records and later retellings tried to present it that way. As we move further into the lives of these women, we will see that their impact was not limited to their immediate families or to palace intrigues. They influenced the succession of emperors, the moral codes promoted by the state, the cultural and intellectual life of Rome, and even the stability of entire regions of the empire. Their legacies are etched in monuments, coins, texts, and traditions, waiting to be recognized for what they truly are. Far from being mere companions, these women were central to the functioning of the imperial system. Their presence complicates the neat, male-centered narrative and forces us to acknowledge that the Roman Empire was shaped by more than the ambitions of its emperors. This exploration begins with a simple yet profound shift in perspective. to see empresses not as background figures, but as actors in their own right. Doing so opens up new ways of understanding how power worked in Rome, how it was negotiated, and how it was sustained. It also challenges us to rethink the assumptions we carry about gender and authority, both in the past and in how we interpret history today. The hidden architects of Rome may have been overlooked for centuries, but their influence remains, waiting to be unveiled. Livia Drusilla stands as one of the most striking figures in Roman imperial history. If the first section of this exploration began with the idea that women were far more influential in the empire than the traditional male-focused narrative allows, then Livia provides the clearest early example of how female authority could take root and shape the very foundations of imperial power. As the wife of Augustus, Rome's first emperor, she occupied a role that did not yet have precedent. There had been no empress before her, no official model to follow, and no clear guidelines about what such a position entailed. Yet through a mixture of personal intelligence, calculated political maneuvering, and an almost unmatched ability to balance public image with private influence, Livia transformed herself from an aristocratic wife into an indispensable partner in the creation of the new imperial order. To reduce her to the role of consort would be to miss the essential truth. She was a central architect of the early empire, a figure whose choices and strategies carried consequences that rippled far beyond her own lifetime. Born into the distinguished Claudian family, Livia was connected from birth to some of the most powerful and traditional elites in Rome. Her lineage alone gave her both prestige and expectation. Yet it was her marriage to Augustus, forged during the turbulent years after the fall of the Republic, that placed her directly at the center of history. When she entered into this union, Augustus was still consolidating his authority after the chaos of civil wars. His image was that of the man who had ended bloodshed and restored stability, but he was also acutely aware of the fragile balance he had to maintain. Power in Rome had shifted from collective republican institutions to the hands of one man, but it needed to appear as though it still respected the traditions of the Senate and the values of the Republic. In this delicate balancing act, Livia became both a partner and a weapon, reinforcing his legitimacy while subtly advancing her own influence. One of Livia's greatest strengths was her ability to embody and project traditional Roman ideals of womanhood while simultaneously wielding power in ways that quietly subverted those expectations. She was presented as the epitome of Roman matronly virtue, modest, loyal, dignified, and devoted to her household. This image was carefully cultivated, for Augustus's regime relied heavily on the notion of moral renewal, emphasizing family, piety, and traditional values. Livia's public persona aligned perfectly with this agenda, making her not only acceptable but also exemplary in the eyes of the Roman people. Statues, coins, and inscriptions portrayed her as the motherly figure of the imperial household, a symbol of stability and continuity. Yet beneath this carefully managed exterior, she exercised influence with precision, guiding Augustus, advising on matters of succession, and ensuring that her family's position within the imperial order remained secure. Her political maneuvering was subtle but decisive. Livia had 2 sons from her first marriage, Tiberius and Drusus. While Augustus had children of his own through his daughter Julia, the question of succession was a perpetual concern. Augustus's reign was long, but it was also experimental in nature, for he had to determine how one man could be succeeded without reviving the chaos of civil war. Livia positioned her sons as viable heirs, particularly Tiberius, and worked tirelessly to ensure that they remained close to the center of power. Over the years, Augustus's initial heirs, his grandsons Gaius and Lucius, both died young, leaving a vacuum. Livia's ability to keep Tiberius in the running, despite personal tensions between Augustus and Tiberius, was a testament to her persistence and strategic sense. By the time Augustus died, Tiberius was firmly established as his successor, a transition that owed as much to Livia's political management as it did to Augustus's own decisions. This success, however, did not come without controversy. Ancient sources often portrayed Livia as ruthless, accusing her of scheming to remove rivals and secure power for her son. Tacitus in particular depicted her as a manipulative figure, whispering in Augustus's ear, engineering deaths, and ensuring that no one stood in Tiberius's way. While it is difficult to separate fact from hostile gossip, the persistence of these accusations reveals how her influence was perceived. Roman historians, steeped in patriarchal assumptions, were uneasy with the idea of a woman wielding such authority. To them, Her involvement could only be explained in terms of ambition and deceit, for women were not supposed to participate in politics openly. The image of Livia as both the virtuous matron and the sinister schemer reflects this tension. She was admired for her dignity and stability, but also feared for the power she clearly possessed. Whether or not she was guilty of the darker charges, there is no doubt that her decisions had lasting consequences for Rome. By securing Tiberius's succession, she ensured that the Julio-Claudian dynasty would continue. This continuity provided stability, but also tied the empire's fate to her family line, shaping the next generation of rulers. Moreover, her model of influence became a blueprint for later empresses. She demonstrated how a woman could operate within the restrictions of a patriarchal society while still exercising real power. Her role was not official. She never held office, nor did she command armies, but her authority was undeniable, drawn from her proximity to Augustus, her reputation for virtue, and her strategic use of family ties. Livia's influence extended beyond succession politics. She was also a patron of the arts and architecture, participating in the broader cultural project of Augustus's reign. The early empire was marked by a deliberate effort to present Rome as renewed, prosperous, and stable after decades of turmoil. Livia's own properties and patronage contributed to this image, reinforcing the dynasty's association with peace and prosperity. She also acted as a moral exemplar, embodying the very values that Augustus sought to enshrine in law through his social and moral legislation. Her household became a model of decorum, discipline, and piety, even if the reality behind closed doors was more complex. This dual role, moral paragon in public, political strategist in private, made her indispensable to the Augustan system. Her partnership with Augustus lasted more than 50 years, and even after his death, she continued to wield influence as the mother of the new emperor. Her status was formalized when she was adopted into the Julian family by Augustus's will, giving her unprecedented symbolic authority. She became Augusta, a title that elevated her beyond the status of any woman before her. Yet her relationship with Tiberius was fraught, for he resented her dominance and sought to distance himself from her influence. Still, her presence loomed large, a reminder that the dynasty owed its survival to her political skill. She lived well into old age, witnessing the reign of her son and the continued dominance of her family. When she finally died, she left behind a legacy that was both celebrated and contested, a testament to the complicated role of women in imperial power. The perception of Livia as both a revered matron and a ruthless schemer captures the contradictions of her life. On one hand, she represented the ideal Roman woman, dignified and loyal, the perfect complement to Augustus's image of moral renewal. On the other hand, her influence in matters of succession, her ability to outmaneuver rivals, and her persistence in securing her family's dominance led many to view her with suspicion. This duality reflects more than just her personal reputation. It reflects the larger unease with female power in a society that struggled to reconcile women's private roles with their public impact. For male historians, a powerful woman could only be understood through the language of manipulation or ambition. For modern readers, however, her life illustrates the resilience and intelligence required to navigate a system that formally denied women authority, yet could not function without their participation. Livia's strategic decisions shaped the early Roman Empire in ways that still resonate. By aligning herself so closely with Augustus and embodying the values he wished to promote, she gave legitimacy to the new imperial system. By securing Tiberius's succession, she ensured continuity at a fragile moment, preventing the empire from sliding back into the chaos of civil war. By serving as a moral exemplar, she reinforced the cultural and ideological foundations of Augustus's reforms. And by leaving behind a model for empresses to follow, she carved out a place for women in the imperial system, demonstrating that influence could be wielded without official titles or formal power. In many ways, Livia represents the essence of what it meant to be a hidden architect of Rome. Her work was often invisible, her contributions obscured by the patriarchal biases of ancient writers, but the effects were unmistakable. She turned the role of empress into a political instrument, showing that proximity to the emperor could be transformed into real authority. Her legacy was not merely personal, it was structural, embedded into the very DNA of the Roman Empire. Later empresses would follow her example, sometimes more openly, sometimes with greater subtlety, but always in her shadow. She set the precedent that female power, though unacknowledged in law, was indispensable in practice. To understand Livia is to understand the paradox of female authority in Rome. The woman who seemed to embody tradition while quietly reshaping it, who was praised as a matron and accused as a schemer, who never held office but influenced the course of the empire for generations. She was not a mere consort, nor a passive observer of her husband's reign. She was a strategist, a partner, and a survivor, whose presence ensured that Augustus's vision for Rome did not end with his death. In unveiling her story, we see not just the life of one woman, but the larger truth that the Roman Empire was never built by men alone. Agrippina the Younger stands as one of the most formidable and infamous women in Roman history, a figure whose ambition and intelligence were matched only by the intensity of the controversies surrounding her name. To move from the story of Livia Drusilla into the life of Agrippina is to trace the evolution of female influence within the imperial system. Livia laid the foundation, shaping the role of empress as one that combined public virtue with private strategy, while Agrippina pushed the boundaries of that precedent, seizing power in ways that startled her contemporaries and left a mark of both fascination and dread on the historical record. If Livia was seen as the matronly partner of Augustus, Agrippina was often painted as the embodiment of unbridled female ambition, willing to use any means to secure power for herself and her son. Yet like Livia, Agrippina was not simply a schemer in the shadows. She was a critical architect of the Roman imperial order in her own time, and her story shows both the possibilities and the perils of female authority in a society still deeply suspicious of women who sought power openly. Agrippina was born into the Julio-Claudian dynasty, a family whose web of marriages, rivalries, and successions defined the early empire. She was the daughter of Germanicus, one of the most popular generals of his age, and Agrippina the Elder, a strong-willed woman who herself had clashed with emperors. Through this lineage, Agrippina was a direct descendant of Augustus, and thus carried the bloodline that gave legitimacy to the dynasty. Her childhood was marked by both privilege and danger, for to be born into the imperial family was to live under constant scrutiny and political risk. After the death of her father under suspicious circumstances, her mother's opposition to Emperor Tiberius led to persecution. Agrippina the Elder eventually died in exile, and her children grew up with the knowledge that imperial favor could vanish overnight. These early experiences must have instilled in Agrippina the Younger a fierce determination never to be powerless, a resolve that would define her adult life. Her rise began with calculated marriages. First wed to Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, she bore a son who would later become Emperor Nero. After the death of Domitius, she maneuvered to maintain her position within the imperial household. At one point, she was even exiled under Emperor Caligula, her own brother, who feared her influence. When Claudius became emperor, Agrippina's fortunes changed. She married him, becoming his fourth wife, and in this marriage she found her greatest opportunity. Claudius, often portrayed as weak or indecisive, provided Agrippina with the platform to exert real power. As his wife, she stepped beyond the traditional role of empress, positioning herself as his partner in governance. She attended Senate meetings, appeared in public alongside him, and ensured that her presence was felt in ways no Roman woman had dared before. Agrippina's ambition was not limited to her own position. She sought above all to secure the throne for her son Nero, even though Claudius had a biological son, Britannicus. To achieve this, she engaged in relentless political maneuvering. She persuaded Claudius to adopt Nero as his son and heir, elevating Nero above Britannicus in the line of succession. She arranged for her son's betrothal to Octavia, Claudius's daughter, further intertwining Nero with the imperial line. These moves were more than mere maternal care. They were calculated strategies to ensure that power would pass into her hands through Nero. Ancient writers often accused her of orchestrating the death of Claudius himself, suggesting that she poisoned him with mushrooms to hasten Nero's rise. Whether this story is fact or fiction, the mere existence of the accusation shows how her contemporaries perceived her, as a woman willing to employ any means, even murder, to secure her goals. Once Nero ascended the throne, Agrippina occupied a position unprecedented in Roman history. She was not simply the mother of the emperor, she was the force behind him. Coins were minted showing Nero and Agrippina side by side, an extraordinary act that placed a woman on equal footing with a reigning emperor. She sat with him in public ceremonies, spoke with authority in political matters, and maintained a network of allies in the Senate and military. For a brief period, It appeared as though Rome had not one ruler but two, with Agrippina exercising power openly rather than discreetly as Livia had done. Her dominance, however, could not last. Nero was young and malleable, but he was also ambitious in his own right, and as he grew older, he resented his mother's control. What began as cooperation soon turned into rivalry, with Agrippina unwilling to step back and Nero increasingly determined to rule independently. The conflict between mother and son became one of the most infamous power struggles in Roman history. Agrippina sought to maintain her influence, reminding Nero of her role in his rise and attempting to control his decisions. Ancient sources describe her as domineering, interfering in his personal relationships, and even threatening to support Britannicus as an alternative if Nero defied her. The tension reached a breaking point when Britannicus died suddenly, with many suspecting poison, a method often linked with Agrippina in the imagination of her enemies. Whether or not she was involved, the event removed the last rival to Nero's sole rule, but it also deepened suspicion and fear around her. Nero eventually moved to eliminate his mother's influence entirely. At first he attempted to marginalize her, removing her guards, stripping her of privileges, and forcing her into a diminished role. But Agrippina was not a woman to retreat quietly. Her determination and her network of supporters made her a continuing threat. In a dramatic and almost theatrical sequence of events, Nero attempted to have her killed in elaborate ways, including arranging for a collapsible boat to sink while she was aboard. When she survived, he resorted to direct violence, sending assassins to finish the job. Her death was brutal, and according to legend, she met it with defiance, baring her body and commanding the killers to strike her womb, the source of the son who had turned against her. The symbolism of this act, whether historical or a later invention, captured the essence of Agrippina's life. A woman defined by her ambition to see her son rule, undone by that very ambition when he no longer needed her. Agrippina's downfall illustrates the precariousness of female power in Rome. Unlike Livia, who maintained influence through careful balance and subtlety, Agrippina was bold, visible, and uncompromising. She pushed the limits of what Roman society could tolerate from a woman, stepping into spaces reserved for men and demanding recognition as an equal. Her very assertiveness, which allowed her to achieve unprecedented authority, also made her vulnerable to backlash. Ancient historians portrayed her as a cautionary tale, a woman consumed by ambition who overreached and paid the price. To Tacitus and others, she was the archetype of dangerous female influence, embodying the fear that women could destabilize the state if they pursued power too openly. Yet to dismiss Agrippina as merely a schemer or villain is to overlook her significance. She was a product of her environment, one in which survival required ruthlessness and ambition was the only safeguard against obscurity or exile. In many ways, her actions mirrored those of male politicians, who used marriage alliances, manipulation, and even murder to advance their careers. What made Agrippina different was not her methods, but her gender, which made such behavior appear unnatural and threatening to her contemporaries. Her story thus reveals the double standard of Roman society. Ambition in men was expected, even admired, while ambition in women was condemned as monstrous. Agrippina's legacy also extends beyond her death. By securing Nero's throne, she shaped the course of the empire for years to come. Nero's reign, marked by volatility, extravagance, and ultimately disaster, was inseparable from the circumstances of his rise. Without Agrippina's maneuvering, Nero would never have been emperor, and the history of Rome would have followed a different path. Her success in placing him on the throne demonstrated the extraordinary potential of female influence, even as her violent end highlighted its dangers. The empire she helped build turned against her, but her imprint remained, a reminder that the story of Rome cannot be told without acknowledging the women who fought to shape it. In comparing Agrippina to Livia, one sees both continuity and contrast. Both women were deeply invested in dynastic survival, both used their positions as mothers to advance their families, and both left legacies that outlived them. Yet where Livia cloaked her influence in modesty and tradition, Agrippina embraced visibility and direct authority. Livia was remembered as a matron who strengthened Augustus's rule, even if accused of scheming in succession. Agrippina was remembered as a mother who secured her son's throne but became his rival. Together, they illustrate the spectrum of female power in Rome, subtle and sustaining on one end, overt and explosive on the other. The empire needed both kinds of influence, even if it condemned them in hindsight. The fall of Agrippina set the stage for the volatile reign of Nero, whose rule became a symbol of excess and instability. Her ambition, which had secured him the throne, also unleashed forces she could not control. Nero's paranoia and cruelty, his alienation from the Senate and elite, and his eventual downfall all unfolded in the shadow of the dynasty Agrippina had fought to preserve. In this sense, her story was not only personal but also deeply political, a turning point in the history of the Julio-Claudian line. She was both a maker of emperors and a victim of the system she helped sustain. Her life and death remind us that the Roman Empire, often described in terms of military conquests and male rulers, was equally shaped by the women who dared to claim their place in its history. Julia Domna stands as another striking example of how women at the center of the Roman imperial household could shape politics, culture, and even the intellectual life of the empire. If Livia Drusilla had shown that female influence could stabilize the foundations of an emerging order, and if Agrippina the Younger had demonstrated the dangers and ambitions of overt power, then Julia Domna carried the story forward by embodying yet another form of female authority. She was not remembered primarily for ruthless intrigue, though she certainly engaged in political maneuvering, but for her extraordinary ability to combine cultural patronage with political acumen. Her reign as empress during the rule of Septimius Severus and her later role as the mother of emperors presented her as both a stabilizing matron and an intellectual force, earning her a unique reputation as the philosopher queen. Born in Emesa, in what is now Syria, Julia Domna was a member of a prominent family whose wealth and influence derived from the hereditary priesthood of the sun god Elagabal. Her Eastern origins distinguished her from many of her predecessors, most of whom had been drawn from the traditional Roman aristocracy. At a time when Rome was increasingly reliant on the provinces for military and political strength, Julia's marriage to Septimius Severus reflected the broader shift toward a more cosmopolitan empire. Severus himself was of North African origin, and their union symbolized the diversity of the imperial household in the 3rd century. Julia brought not only prestige from her family's standing, but also intelligence, charisma, and an affinity for intellectual life that would define her legacy. From the beginning, Julia's marriage to Severus was not merely a personal bond, but a political partnership. Severus valued her counsel and made her an active participant in his administration. Unlike many earlier empresses, who influenced events behind closed doors, Julia was openly acknowledged as a companion in governance. In official titles and inscriptions, she was honored as Mother of the Camp, a recognition of her presence alongside Severus during his military campaigns. She traveled extensively with him, including to the distant frontiers of Britain, where Severus conducted campaigns late in his reign. Her willingness to share in these arduous journeys reinforced the image of unity between emperor and empress, while also allowing her to observe and engage with matters of governance firsthand. In this sense, she extended the role of empress beyond the domestic and symbolic into the practical and political. Her intellectual interests added another dimension to her authority. Julia was a noted patron of philosophers, artists, and scholars, surrounding herself with a circle of thinkers who flourished under her protection. Among the most famous was the sophist Philostratus, who wrote the Life of Apollonius of Tyana, a work dedicated to her. This circle was not merely ornamental. It reflected her deep engagement with philosophical ideas, particularly those of Stoicism, which resonated with the political ethos of the Severan regime. The image of Julia as a philosopher queen was carefully cultivated, but it was also genuine, for she was deeply invested in the life of the mind. Her patronage ensured that intellectual and cultural pursuits remained vibrant at a time when Rome was under great military and political strain. By linking the imperial household with philosophy and learning, Julia contributed to the legitimacy of Severus's rule, projecting Rome as not only a military power, but also a cultural and intellectual beacon. This cultural role intersected with her political one in meaningful ways. Philosophy, especially Stoicism, emphasized duty, endurance, and rational governance, qualities that were essential for an emperor who sought to hold together a vast and turbulent empire. Julia's alignment with these ideals helped present the Severan dynasty as one rooted in wisdom and moral authority, countering the perception of military brutality or opportunism. Her presence in this role gave Severus's rule a moral and intellectual depth, enhancing the dynasty's prestige. In this way, Julia transformed the traditional role of an empress into something new, blending cultural patronage with political utility in a manner that distinguished her from both Livia and Agrippina. Her influence became even more pronounced after the death of Severus in York in the early 3rd century. With his passing, the empire fell to his sons Caracalla and Geta. The rivalry between the brothers quickly escalated into open hostility, threatening the stability of the Severan dynasty. Julia, as their mother, attempted to mediate between them, urging cooperation and unity. Her efforts, however, were in vain. The brothers detested one another, and Caracalla ultimately arranged the murder of Geta in their mother's presence, a horrifying act that left Julia both traumatized and politically indispensable. Despite her grief, she chose to remain at the center of power, working alongside Caracalla to maintain order in the aftermath of the fratricide. This decision illustrates the resilience and pragmatism that defined her career. Even when confronted with personal tragedy, she placed the stability of the empire above all else. During Caracalla's reign, Julia continued to exercise substantial influence. She accompanied him on campaigns, managed correspondence, and even administered aspects of the government during his absences. She was deeply involved in imperial decision-making, and her presence was more than symbolic. When Caracalla was assassinated in the east, Julia once again found herself at the center of imperial crisis. She initially sought to negotiate a transition, but her health was failing, and she soon died, likely from cancer, in the Syrian city of Antioch. Her death marked the end of a remarkable career, but her impact endured. Julia's unique blend of cultural and political authority distinguished her from other empresses. She was not remembered primarily for ruthless scheming, as Agrippina had been, nor solely for stabilizing virtue, as Livia had been, but for embodying the fusion of intellect and governance. She proved that an empress could be a philosopher as well as a politician, a patron as well as a matron. Her Eastern heritage also reflected the growing interconnectedness of the empire, as power increasingly rested on a foundation that extended far beyond the city of Rome itself. In her, the empire saw not just the wife of an emperor, but a partner in rulership and a model of cultured authority. Ancient sources, while often hostile to powerful women, generally acknowledged Julia's intelligence and her role as a unifying figure. Cassius Dio, for example, spoke of her wisdom and her ability to command respect even in the most trying circumstances. Later writers sometimes idealized her as the philosopher queen, a title that captured both her patronage of learning and her personal affinity for intellectual life. The fact that she could be remembered in this way, rather than as a schemer or a corrupter, highlights how her particular form of influence was both effective and palatable to Roman sensibilities. By presenting herself as a matron devoted to wisdom and virtue, she avoided some of the criticisms leveled against women like Agrippina, whose overt ambition was seen as threatening. Yet Julia's career also shows the limits of female power in Rome. Despite her intelligence and ability, she could not prevent the murder of one son by another, nor could she ultimately secure a stable succession after Caracalla's death. Her influence was great, but it was bounded by the violence and instability of the imperial system itself. Even so, her ability to endure, to remain relevant across the reigns of her husband and sons, and to shape the cultural and political identity of the Severan dynasty, testifies to her remarkable skill. In the broader narrative of women in Roman history, Julia Domna represents a different kind of power. Where Livia worked through subtlety and Agrippina through audacity, Julia worked through intellect. She demonstrated that the imperial household could serve not only as a center of political intrigue, but also as a hub of cultural and philosophical life. She left behind a legacy not of scandal but of learning, not of ruthless ambition but of thoughtful patronage. In doing so, she expanded the possibilities of what it meant to be an empress, leaving a model for those who came after her. Her story, connected to those of Livia and Agrippina, reveals the diversity of ways in which women shaped the Roman Empire. All three operated within a patriarchal system that denied them formal power, yet each found a way to wield influence that altered the course of history. Livia secured stability at the foundation of the empire, Agrippina pushed the limits of female authority through raw ambition, and Julia demonstrated that cultural and intellectual leadership could be a form of political strength. Together, their stories form a tapestry of female power in Rome, a reminder that the empire was not merely the creation of emperors and generals, but also of the women who, in different ways, guided its destiny. The significance of Julia Domna lies not only in her actions, but also in her symbolism. She was a woman from the eastern provinces who rose to the pinnacle of Roman power, embodying the empire's growing diversity. She was a philosopher queen whose court became a center of learning, showing that Rome's greatness lay not only in conquest but also in culture. And she was a political partner who helped sustain one of the most challenging dynasties of the 3rd century, proving that an empress could be more than a wife or mother. She could be a stateswoman in her own right. Her legacy, like those of Livia and Agrippina, challenges the narrow, male-centered narrative of Roman history and reminds us that the architects of empire included women whose influence, though often hidden, was nonetheless profound. The stories of Livia Drusilla, Agrippina the Younger, and Julia Domna offer us a remarkable journey through the possibilities and limits of female power in ancient Rome. Each woman occupied the same broad role, that of empress, but each approached it differently, shaped by her personality, her circumstances, and the shifting needs of the empire itself. Together they reveal that the imperial household was not merely a domestic sphere, but a crucial center of politics, culture, and ideology. To look at them side by side is to see not isolated anecdotes of female ambition or influence, but a pattern that challenges the traditional male-dominated narrative of Roman history. These empresses were not passive companions. They were actors who bent the structures of power to their advantage, leaving legacies that cannot be ignored if we want a complete picture of the Roman world. Livia Drusilla, the Iron Matron, exemplified the careful, measured use of influence in a system that had only just emerged from the ruins of the Republic. She cloaked her authority in modesty, embodying Roman ideals of matronly virtue even as she quietly shaped succession politics, guided Augustus, and ensured that her family line would dominate the throne. Agrippina the Younger, by contrast, operated with striking audacity, seeking openly to share in imperial power and to place her son Nero on the throne. Her ambition was undeniable, and it secured the dynasty's survival for a time, but her unwillingness to retreat led to her downfall. Julia Domna then offered a different model altogether, blending intellectual patronage with political partnership. She was remembered as a philosopher queen, a woman who carried not only the burden of empire, but also the mantle of culture, whose household became a hub of philosophical and artistic exchange. The collective impact of these women lies in how they shifted perceptions, both in their own time and in the centuries that followed. In their lifetimes, they forced Romans to confront the reality that female power was not an aberration, but a recurring element of imperial politics. Even when historians such as Tacitus or Cassius Dio sought to portray them as schemers, manipulators, or dangerous influences, the very act of writing about them in such terms confirmed their importance. The empire could not be told without their names, and their actions left consequences that reverberated far beyond their lifespans. In later memory, they became symbols of both admiration and fear, models of virtue or cautionary tales of excess, depending on the perspective of the writer. What unites all these depictions, however, is an acknowledgement that they mattered, that Rome's destiny was shaped not only by emperors but also by empresses. This realization leads naturally into contemporary discussions about female leadership and the writing of history itself. Too often, the stories of powerful women have been filtered through lenses of suspicion or scandal, their achievements dismissed as manipulation or their authority framed as unnatural. The narratives surrounding Livia, Agrippina, and Julia illustrate this pattern vividly. Where men who schemed for power were often described as ambitious statesmen or clever strategists, women who engaged in the same acts were branded as ruthless or dangerous. This double standard remains recognizable even today, when female leaders around the world are still judged by harsher standards than their male counterparts, their assertiveness often labeled as arrogance or aggression. By revisiting the lives of Roman empresses with a more balanced eye, we can see not only their flaws but also their strengths, and we can recognize that their legacies challenge the biases that have long shaped historical narratives. Historical revisionism is not about inventing new stories, but about re-examining old ones with greater fairness. For centuries, the history of Rome was written as a story of emperors, generals, and senators. Women appeared only as side characters, often vilified or idealized but rarely understood as political figures in their own right. The careful study of empresses like Livia, Agrippina, and Julia allows us to correct this imbalance. It reminds us that history is never a neutral record, but a reflection of the perspectives and prejudices of those who write it. To restore these women to their rightful place in the narrative is to enrich our understanding of Rome itself, revealing the complexity of an empire that was sustained not only by military conquests and political reforms, but also by the subtle, persistent, and sometimes overt interventions of women. The lessons we draw from their stories extend far beyond antiquity. They encourage us to ask questions about how power operates in any society, how it is negotiated, and how it is remembered. They also invite us to consider who else in history has been overlooked or misrepresented. How many other women, in Rome or elsewhere, played decisive roles that have been diminished by biased storytelling. How many contributions from marginalized voices remain buried under layers of prejudice or neglect. By reflecting on these questions, we not only honor the memory of those who have been forgotten, but also challenge ourselves to think critically about the stories we tell today. Livia's patient strategies, Agrippina's bold ambitions, and Julia's intellectual leadership together form a spectrum of approaches to female power in a patriarchal world. Each succeeded in different ways, each faced unique challenges, and each left behind a legacy that shaped the empire. Their lives remind us that history is not just the story of great men, but of human beings in all their variety, negotiating the structures of their societies to leave a mark on the world. By unveiling their hidden contributions, we open the door to a richer and more inclusive understanding of the past. The Roman Empire, in all its grandeur and brutality, was never built by men alone. It was sustained by families, by partnerships, by cultural networks, and by the often unacknowledged influence of women at its core. To study these empresses is to recognize that power can take many forms, subtle or overt, cultural or political, intellectual or strategic, and that all of these forms matter. As we conclude this exploration, let us carry forward the awareness that the voices missing from history are as important as the ones preserved. By asking who has been forgotten, we take the first step toward a fuller, truer understanding of the human story. If the lives of Livia, Agrippina, and Julia inspire anything, it is the recognition that there are countless other figures waiting to be rediscovered. They invite us to look again at the margins of history, to seek out the stories of those who shaped events but were written out of the official record. They challenge us to question how narratives are formed, whose voices are heard, and whose are silenced. And they encourage us to engage more deeply with history, not as a fixed tale handed down unchanged, but as an ongoing conversation, one that evolves as we uncover new evidence and new perspectives. So as we reflect on the hidden architects of Rome, let us also ask, who else has been hidden from our view? What other stories remain untold, waiting for us to listen? And how might our understanding of the past, and perhaps even of the present, change when we bring those voices into the light? If these questions resonate with you, I invite you to continue exploring with us, to join in uncovering the overlooked and the forgotten, and to engage with more stories that reveal the depth and diversity of our shared history.